Thanks, Doc. I'm happy to be here. So there's a lot you can talk about success stories with whales, and gray whales come to mind as one of the great success stories, and I will tell you more about that in a second. But the point of my talk is step outside the boundaries of just sort of current time, seasonal time, and talk about a bit about deep time and why that matters for a success story like gray whales. My day job is based at a place right across the street, a block away at the Natural History Museum. You can walk in right off the street into the Sant Ocean Hall and see this, a beautiful display about the evolutionary history of whales, how they once had land ancestors. And I'm going to spoil something for people in the front audience and a lot of other people. You can see a cast here, painted cast, of a fossil gray whale jawbone. I'm going to talk about a bit about this, but one thing I won't tell you is where it's from. I'm going to reveal that later in the talk. So you can go upstairs from the Sant Ocean Hall into the Osteology Hall. And I really encourage you to do this because this is a hall unlike any of the others. It's been unchanged since about the 1960s. You can see that in the typography and a bit of the exhibit structure. But if you look up, you will see the skeleton of a gray whale. And that is not just any gray whale. That is a gray whale from the Western Pacific. We don't have very many specimens from this part of the Pacific. Gray whales live in the North Pacific today. But that specimen was actually collected by Roy Chapman Andrews. Now, for those not familiar with Roy Chapman Andrews, he was kind of the prototype for Indiana Jones. He was a curator at the museum, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and did his PhD on whales before he went off to Mongolia looking for human origins, and lo and behold found dinosaur eggs. And that's what kind of that's why we remember Roy Chapman Andrews predominantly in the media. But he did write this book called Whale Hunting with Camera and Gun. And we have to realize that this is 100 years ago, 1916, a very different time, kind of more of a Rooseveltian ethic to conservation. Go out and bag the specimen, bring it back to the museum, and then we can talk about conservation. Now, that's it. I don't want to get into that philosophy, but that's really the view at the time. Now, what he did was also document all this with a camera. And here we have one of these Korean gray whales from the Western Pacific on a flensing platform being processed. That specimen in the Osteology Hall might actually be this one in the picture. I haven't actually tracked and united that documentation. But this is what we're looking at with the history of gray whales, is a massive exploitation that occurred at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. This is 1916. So by this time, most of the gray whale population in the North Pacific had been depleted by human hunting. A lot of this happened at one of their specific places called Scammons Lagoon. This is in Baja, California. Gray whales undertake this massive migration from Baja to Alaska every year, breed down in Baja in Mexico, migrate some 6,000 to 10,000 miles up to the Bering and Chukchi Seas where they feed. So we'll get back to that in case it's not clear. Gray whales now, I think everybody realizes, have recovered from massive exploitation. Here we are in 2017. Gray whales now in the North Pacific hover around 26,000, 28,000 individuals, give or take. You probably know about them if you've seen these Wyland murals all across anywhere on the West Coast. They're beloved icons of natural history on the West Coast. And if you're lucky enough to go down to Scammons Lagoon today, there is no whaling going on down there. There's whale watching. You can go out, and marine mammal laws are different in Mexico than they are in the United States. You can actually pet gray whales if you want to. So this is where it gets interesting when we look at the science about where gray whales are today. A paper published about 10 years ago out of Steve Palumbi's lab. Steve is here today, he's walking around. He and one of his postdocs at the time, Liz Alter, did a study looking at DNA in gray whales and wanted to know what DNA diversity was like before human hunting. We know the signal of human hunting. We can time that pretty closely. How many whales were there before whaling? The short answer is a lot, but we just don't know how many. And the question about how many magnitudes more gray whales there were is really important for management today. If we want to know how many gray whales should be out there in the oceans, the United States Marine Mammal Protection Act has exclusions for hunting. So there are some indigenous tribes that do hunt gray whales. And also gray whales are the victims of shipping lanes, of ghost nets, there's entanglements, there's strandings. So we actually want to know, really, what is our baseline expectation for gray whales before humans? Now, I got interested in this because I'm interested in their fossil record. And I knew that there are fossil gray whales all throughout the North Pacific. And what I have here on the right are this kind of jagsawed pattern through time going up and down, up and down. This is sea level change over the last 3 million years or so. And we have gray whale fossils that predate the onset of the ice ages, sea level rise and fall. So if we look at their migration plot going from Baja to Alaska, anybody who realizes something about deep time recognizes that when you drop sea level, you lose that destination that they want to go to in the top left corner. The Bering and Chukchi Seas, at many times, over 20 times, throughout the last 2.5 to 3 million years, was an emergent platform. There's going to be no food in dry land for a gray whale to feed on. Also, if you have ice sheets going all the way down to Seattle, to say nothing about ice sheets covering Boston, New York, and all the way down here to DC, where are gray whales going during glacial maxima? So I looked at this in some detail, and I think the answer has a lot to do not with a picture like this. Gray whales are notably ice tolerant. If you remember about 25, 30 years ago, gray whales were stuck up in Alaska, and there was this human intervention that united both Russians and Americans, and this shared cause for concern for about a dozen gray whales. They are just fine in the ice pack. So it's not about tolerance of ice. It has more to do with their flexibility. Gray whales can actually feed on a variety of prey resources. And we know that there are some today that don't actually migrate. They hang out around Vancouver Island and off of Washington State, and aren't a part of the 99% that migrate from Baja to Alaska. So that flexibility, I think, is important, but I'm going to shift for a second and tell you this jawbone, which I have a picture of right here, is not from the Pacific at all. This is from the Atlantic Ocean. This jawbone was actually found in Gray's Reef in the National Marine, JY Reef, which is part of Gray's Reef National Marine Fisheries Sanctuaries, which is right off the coast of Georgia, here on the Atlantic coast. So it turns out that gray whales have actually been in the Atlantic basin for far longer than they've been in the Pacific basin. We just don't have them here today. Why they went extinct some 300 to 400 years ago, we don't know. It doesn't have anything to do with Yankee whaling, but we do find their fossils. And so I have colleagues here from the University of Georgia who were doing something else on a closed reef and discovered not just one, but 2 different jawbones right there on JY Reef. You can now see what that looks like here. It has all the diagnostic features of a gray whale. That is to say, it looks nothing like any other baleen whale that we know of. This jawbone is actually relatively small for a gray whale, and as is the second one that they found. These are juvenile specimens that are found off the coast of Georgia, and we know that they're about 10,000 years difference in age. This one here is about 30,000 years old. The other one is about 20,000 years old. This is an ice age gray whale here off the Atlantic coast. And so there's a whole hidden story to gray whales actually on the Atlantic seaboard. And what that's important here, because you can see on some parts of this jagged pattern through time of sea level change, sea level is actually much higher than it is today. And think about where this is going in Anthropocene Earth. We are heading towards these potential realities of having very high sea levels. If you have high sea levels, then maybe going through an ice-free Northwest Passage isn't as difficult. So, stepping back once more before we go forward in time, Scammon, 1874, he drew this picture of gray whales up in Alaska because he was not just a whaling captain who did participate in the slaughter of gray whales, he was also a naturalist at the end of the 19th century, and he was the first one to document living gray whales. But he wasn't the first one to name them. The first person to do so was a scientist in Sweden who found a fossil gray whale skeleton and gave it its scientific name that we use today, Escherichthus robustus. So there's this hidden history of gray whales in the Atlantic. And this is where it gets even more surprising. I remember being on the Marine Mammal Listserv in 2012 when this picture cropped up. It was sent by an Israeli scientist, and he said, "I think we saw a gray whale off the coast of Israel in the Mediterranean. Please tell me I'm wrong." And that diagnostic feature, along with all the other photos that he sent, including this tail fluke, looks like no other whale on the planet. It's clear as day a gray whale. And then 22 days later, that same gray whale showed up off the coast of Spain near Barcelona. So is this a little lost gray whale? That could be. But 2 years later, another gray whale was spotted off the coast of Namibia in the South Atlantic. So now we have 2 little lost gray whales. What I think this is telling us is that we have to think much more broadly about the history of a lot of these organisms, especially for highly adaptable and migratory species. You know, adaptability, that was a theme in Roland's talk, that's coming out here. So on the right-hand side of this picture, this is a figure from that paper describing the gray whale seen in the Mediterranean in 2012. They've tipped North America on its side to show the possible pathways through an Arctic that are either hugging the coastlines or going a direct route to the Mediterranean. In the case of the whale that was seen off the coast of Israel, that's a 22 to 24,000 kilometer migration. That's nearly the same distance that you would take to go around the whole Earth. So we always knew gray whales were highly migratory, some of the champion migration specialists among mammals. This little gray whale definitely proves that point. But I think what that says is that we have to realize that the future of gray whales is, on this coast, going to look something like this. This is a picture off of California that you could see today, here in April. Off the coast, you see all the houses on the coastline. That's the Monterey Formation in the background, that rock unit. This is the only thing that tells us it's not the East Coast. I think this is what we're looking for in the future, a very flexible, highly adaptive species that will eventually recolonize the East Coast. How soon this will happen, who knows? But certainly with Arctic sea ice melting predictions being what they are, we're looking at a summer ice-free Arctic potentially in the next 10 to 15 years. Certainly that's a migratory pathway for not just gray whales, but many other species. And I think a lesson we're seeing here is that if we're aware of these ecological surprises, they're actually telling us a lot more about signals, evolutionary signals and ecological signals, than the raw data that we merely get from looking at oceanographic changes through time. And that's it. That's my point. Thanks.